And good afternoon from Philadelphia. Frank here with yet another episode of UFO News Network Sunday. A little bit of update on some various things that have been happening around the UFO field. A couple big stories this week, and we are going to get to it. Basically, a quick review of the season premiere of Unidentified last night, and also some more information regarding the Wilson notes. It only took a year, but within the last couple weeks or so, the proponents for the notes actually have provided some level of evidence that is interesting. We will discuss that, plus some additional matters that have come up regarding the notes that I think are well worth going over in detail. But let's get right to it. Let's first talk about the season premiere of Unidentified last night. Now, basically, the show concerned military cases, new cases that have not been discussed openly. These witnesses came forward essentially to the TTSA team, and this was sort of a heads up that I had gotten several months ago that the new season would focus very largely and heavily on new cases. Important to note that none of these cases are actually cases that took place during the time that ATIP was running. From 2007 to 2012, but they are interesting cases, good cases, basically older cases, two of them from the Vietnam War era. One of them over the Pacific, one of them in Vietnam itself, and then another case that took place during the Balkans War, and a fourth case that took place while during our continued efforts over in Afghanistan. So basically, military witnesses, very credible, describing aircraft doing otherworldly flight characteristics, maneuvers, and again, very interesting. One thing that I did like about it, especially, obviously, I always like when the witnesses come forward and we find out about new cases, but also a little bit of analysis, and I think some cogent analysis in the discussions between Elizondo, Mellon's involved, Justice is involved. The team goes over a few things, and some excellent points were broached. Obviously, the more recent cases, our technology is advanced, so it gets into a more gray area, if you will, in terms of whether or not it's something possibly extraterrestrial or possibly something that we have developed ourselves. And the point was made that, well, that might be a little bit more open to question. These UFOs that we're seeing now are also demonstrating the same kinds of characteristics that are reported, back as early as the 60s, certainly in regard to two of the cases that were brought forward during the show. So what you have here is it's pretty obvious we didn't have anything. There's no question that we had nothing back in those days with those kinds of flight characteristics. So the only remaining possibility, since you believe the witnesses, are that what was seen might well have been extraterrestrial nature. And also a point that Elizondo made that I think was quite important. Even if we do develop this kind of tech, it ultimately comes out because it ultimately gets used. That's really the key there. So if it's getting used, we generally have a pretty good idea about it. So really like the show, really like the fact that the tip that we got from a source that this would be a focus on the new season panned out. So obviously, we talk to that source again going forward. It lends a lot more credence to what I've heard as compared to what some other people who are in the field are hearing from sources that they've gotten. Maybe things check out and maybe they don't. Maybe I'll get into that a little bit more as we get over into the Wilson notes. But we got a good tip on that one, and that's what I've been saying going back for quite a few months now. So that one did check out. They don't always check out, but that one in particular did, and certainly glad of that. Looks like there's going to be 8 episodes as compared to, I believe, what was originally reported as 10. So we know what's already in the bag for this week, obviously. Next week, apparently, the focus is going to be very much on the triangle UFO sightings, another interesting topic. David Marler is apparently going to be interviewed on the topic. He's already discussed that openly, so that is going to happen, and that's going to be the focus there. It looks like the focus is going to be on sightings, and hopefully maybe some new sightings that Marler has, or maybe that Elizondo and team has gotten tipped off to. Obviously, they've been very openly since the start of this program, openly soliciting for witnesses to come forward, especially of the military variety, people who can back up what they're saying in terms of their military service. And obviously, they've gotten some of those. Obviously, Dave Beatty did the same thing with the Nimitz and Princeton case and some other cases as well. So, yeah, I mean, if you ask them, they'll come forward and they'll talk. I think in this new environment, that is a good thing. That is certainly something that you have to give credit to TTSA for, and as far as changing the atmosphere where people are a lot more willing to come forward and to discuss sightings that they've encountered. So that's a good thing. I'm really not going to go into too much more detail about the show, basically for the simple reason is, just watch it yourself and make up your own mind. But I have to say, this is the type of thing that the more hardcore nuts and bolts types like me, we love this stuff. I've always felt that UFO witnesses are generally and almost exclusively pretty reliable. They're good. We like what they've got to say, and we want to see more of that, and hopefully more of that is forthcoming. And next, let's move on to the Wilson Notes topic. A lot has happened since the last show here. And last week there was a big Zoom meeting involving a number of people involved with backing the Wilson Notes. And I'll go through most of the important stuff. Well, the important stuff from my view. But one thing they started out with this, and I will start out with it too. And that is basically Jack Rigney, who originally provided the notes. He said that he's gotten them from a still unidentified source who got them directly from the Edgar Mitchell estate. And I have taken some issue in the past, not passing judgment really one way or the other, but regarding some of the claims from the note proponents saying that they definitely came from the Mitchell estate. I was obviously a little bit suspect on all that for I think some fairly obvious reasons. One was, and this didn't come from Rigney, but it came from proponents of the notes, was basically that the way that the unnamed individual acquired the notes was because the folks managing the Mitchell estate were going to throw them away, and that immediately raised a red flag to me. That sounded highly improbable, and I think that I will be able to back that up. Firstly, anything that any astronaut owns is not going to be just thrown away. That is fairly obvious, and there is a lengthy track record, in fact, of Mitchell while he was still alive, and his estate generating revenue as a result of his possessions in all forms. While he was still alive, Edgar Mitchell was trying to obviously generate some revenue based on possessions that he had. Very famously, he was sued by the federal government back in 2011 when he put a camera that he had used on the moon up for auction through an auction house called Bonham's. They had estimated that at auction this camera might fetch $60,000 to $80,000. So there is a tremendous value. Well, obviously that's a piece that had been to the moon. But really, anything that is in the possession of an astronaut, a moonwalker, is going to have some value. So the idea that these items would have been just chucked in the trash if somebody didn't grab them seems a bit silly, and I'll go a little bit more into that as we go along. But just revisiting this particular instance, the litigation requested the camera be returned to NASA. Mitchell's position was that NASA had given him the camera as a gift. Bottoms withdrew the camera. Mitchell ended up as part of a settlement, donating the camera to the National Air and Space Museum. And, I'm not bringing this up as a way of knocking Mitchell. I do believe that he was given the camera, that it was his possession. It was up to him to do with it as he chose. And if he wanted to cash in on it a little bit while he was still alive, I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. And in fact, Congress enacted a law that confirmed full ownership rights of artifacts to astronauts on Apollo, Mercury, and Gemini as well, space missions. So again, no issues with Mitchell on this one. Certainly he got screwed as far as I'm concerned on this, but I do just bring it up. Again, it points to the value of anything an astronaut might own, and nothing would be chucked out. Certainly, even his UFO material. Obviously, with the recent passing of Stanton Friedman, his archives are being poured over. James McDonald's archives are located over at the University of Colorado. There was came up with a couple of very interesting finds myself, based on the papers of two-time Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling. His archives are housed over at the University of Oregon, or Oregon State University, I believe it is. Sorry about that. But Oregon State University, including his UFO material. And in fact, there was a blog dedicated to the contents of that, and there was an article written about his UFO materials that were in the archives, and that is the contents of that provided me with leads that led to a couple stories. One is obviously the infamous Socorro case that Pauling was interested enough in to follow up on, and another related to his possible potential involvement in the Condon Committee, where he himself outlined how he would like to see a UFO investigation run. A couple of very interesting things, and again, that's Linus Pauling. So the idea that any papers whatsoever regarding Edgar Mitchell or anyone else, wouldn't have any value and would have gotten thrown in the trash. So that particular part of the narrative did not ring true. Rigney did, in fact, has never said that, but this is something that was passed along by some others who were proponents of the docs. But based on an interview with Keith Basterfield, and also based on Rigney's own comments during this particular Zoom meeting last Sunday, he has never mentioned that. But let's also go through some additional things related to Mitchell and how his estate may or may not have been handled. Obviously, there was a piece of property involved, and this is the property. A very nice place, obviously, that got sold off. And then there was also hang on a sec here, let's go over to it. There was also an estate sale that was handled by an auction house, an estate sale company in Florida after his passing. And if you look through some of the items here, you'll see them. I mean, literally jackets, face masks, all manner of things here, pictures, posters, furniture. Even let me scroll down. This one, books that he owned, musical instruments, glasses. They were literally selling everything off here. Roller skates. You could have owned a pair of Edgar Mitchell's roller skates. So again, that idea that if it weren't for this guy saving these UFO papers from being tossed in the trash, then we wouldn't know about these notes. That was always highly suspect. But again, I want to make clear here that Rigney, that never came from Rigney. So you have to be careful in terms of what you believe and what you hear. It's not always accurate, and always best to get back to the original source. For this one, Rigney's the source. About as far as we can take it back now, and his what he had to say on that Zoom meeting last week obviously pushed my needle of believing or disbelieving a little bit towards these documents actually coming from the Mitchell estate. But again, I wouldn't say that has actually been proved. He did add some additional details that he had actually met Edgar Mitchell a number of different times, and I think that's important. I think it's also important to ask the question, if Jack Rigney has some photographs, he said he met Mitchell multiple times, and that this guy was a friend of Mitchell's. In fact, a name has been proffered up during the interview between Basterfield and Rigney last year, that if he did in fact meet Mitchell a couple times, something he should have been able to produce and in order to buttress these claims about the notes would have been a photograph with himself and Mitchell. You think that the guy can travel from Australia to Florida and pick up these notes and meet Mitchell a number of times. Certainly during those meetings, he would have been able to produce a camera and get a photograph with the guy. Again, I'm not questioning Rigney's honesty here, but again, if you think that these notes really represent what you're claiming, what you would want to do, and I don't necessarily mean this just towards Rigney, but really towards anybody who's involved in all this, I think what you would want to do is buttress those claims as much as you possibly can as you're making them, and not raise some fairly obvious questions. Rigney has claimed that he met Mitchell a number of times. Well, again, you want to prove it. You don't want to just say it. So that's that point. There were some other points on the show that we were on the show last Sunday, that Zoom meeting that I want to get to. So we got that out of the way. Basically, my truth meter, again, leaning a little bit more towards the side that the notes did in fact come from Mitchell's estate. But again, the claims that they do, stating that as fact, well, we don't really even know that yet, because again, even Rigney is saying that they were provided to him by a third party. So unless he saw those notes pass over, I would say that is not proved yet. But at least they are making some progress. Now, the next piece that came out as a result of this Wilson Notes Super Summit last Sunday was something that was turned up by James Iandoli, old friend of the show, of course, and I've known James for a long time. He wasn't able to do the show because he's got obligations, of course, but he was able to turn up this piece, and he did get a good bit of credit, and of course he deserves it. What this is this was on the Stephen Greer website, and what this is an initial pitch letter from Commander Miller to Admiral Wilson, basically pitching a presentation by Greer, possibly by Mitchell. Things are still a little up in the air in terms of the full number of participants, but basically a pitch for a meeting, a presentation to Wilson and any others who wanted to take part, obviously, to take a listen to whatever Stephen Greer has to offer regarding UFOs. Now, what I think is important in this letter is the date, and of course it is in June of 1995. Now, nobody questions that the Pentagon briefing involving Wilson, Miller, Edgar Mitchell, Stephen Greer did take place, and they're all in agreement on the general date, that it was in April of 1997. So now we have a little bit of evidence, at least, what Wilson's thinking on this particular subject was, at least going into the meeting. And what we see is a pitch for this meeting that happens 22 months before the meeting takes place. So Wilson is, I think this demonstrates this quite clearly, at least going into this meeting, is not so hot to hear everything that Stephen Greer has to say about UFOs that he immediately clears his schedule and say, let's do this next week. No, that's obviously not what happened. Now, I did follow up on this a little bit. I do understand that and I think this is obvious, although what I've heard may or may not be 100% accurate. And in fact, the person who told me this isn't even 100% sure himself. But there may have been some back and forth along the way in terms of Wilson possibly giving Greer some tips, some helpful advice in terms of what to look for, that type of thing. But again, that's not certain. And I would say what also is, what would be certain is Wilson didn't receive this letter and then all of a sudden decide in, let's say, March of 97, hey, Commander Miller, remember that thing that you pitched me on about UFOs almost 2 years ago? Let's do it next week. So there's obviously some back and forth going on over this lengthy period of time. But bottom line, between the time that Wilson was initially pitched on receiving a UFO briefing and the time that he actually received it, almost 2 years, would certainly seem to indicate that he's not so hot on this topic that he necessarily is clearing out his calendar to hear Stephen Greer talk about UFOs. So that is not happening. Now, let's go through some timelines based on what we know about what's in the notes and what we know in terms of what actually happened. Now, in the notes, at the very end, on page 15, per EWD, Eric W. Davis, Wilson asked for a briefing book of his work, send other papers if I want to. He's given an office address in DC2 mail, and then, and this is the key point, will retire to Midwest and close office in 2003. Now, we know what happened regarding Wilson after he retired from the Navy. And here it is, basically. After retiring from the Navy in 2002, Vice Admiral Wilson joined Alliant Tech Systems as president of ATK Missile Systems Company in Woodland Hills, California. He was elected corporate senior vice president in August 2003. So he's not retiring to the Midwest. He's continuing working. In fact, he does continue for the better part of a decade working for ATK Tech Systems. And looks like he also worked for some wholly owned subsidiaries down the road. I'll get into those details. For those who are curious, ATK has since been bought out by Northrop Grumman. So I just mentioned that in passing. But during the time that Wilson worked for them, apparently was all ATK at that point. So he's elected, from 2003 to 2006, he served in Minneapolis, Minnesota as president of ATK Precision Systems, again, a $600 million business group specializing in various weapons, ammunition, and so on, defense electronics, force protection systems, and so on and so forth. Now, some folks might say, well, when he's retiring to the Midwest, it means he's going to Minneapolis. I don't know if I would describe Minneapolis or the Twin Cities necessarily as the Midwest. He must have some idea of what his immediate plans are after retirement, and you would think that that would have been included in there in some detail as compared to, well, I'm just going to retire and to the Midwest and close my office, when clearly he did not retire. He had quite a decade-long career with the ATK, and then finally finishing up from 2006 to 2009. He was ATK Senior Vice President for Tidewater Operations and Combatant Command Relations, and in that position, he did more. But basically, what this indicates is that he had close to a decade-long career with ATK, certainly not retiring to the Midwest and closing his office. He did a little bit more than that. Now, when we're on the subject of timelines, let's also explore the timelines for NIDS. Now, and this little piece here from the NIDS website, which is archived in the web archive, the Wayback Machine. This from October 15th, 2004, 2 months to the day after the Davis-Wilson meeting purportedly took place. Now, this is from Bob Bigelow himself. We at the National Institute for Discovery Science have come to a time in which a decision must be made as to the direction of the Institute. We've labored long and hard, coming to the conclusion to place NIDS in an inactive status. And he lists a number of reasons, but the key reason is, number one, we have not had the need to do any major investigative work for over 2.5 years. Now, this is very interesting, because the pro-doc people keep hammering home the point that Eric Davis went to this meeting, pumped Wilson for all this information, wrote up these detailed notes, and then ran them back to NIDS. Well, that would have been 6 months after NIDS has done any major investigative work. So in other words, they had this dropped in their laps and basically didn't do anything with it. It didn't make any kind of impression on them. There was no follow-up on their part. So I think that is a very interesting point to make. And again, they basically ran out of stuff to run down. So there's that. Now, let's take a look at Eric Davis's timeline in relation to NIDS. Now, here we go again. This is the old Wayback Machine. And we see from April of 2002, Eric Davis is a staff member on NIDS. And then in August of 2002, Eric Davis is no longer a staff member at NIDS. And then the month that he was meeting supposedly with Admiral Wilson, again, he is no longer a staff member at NIDS. So the scenario purported in the notes is a little odd when you think about it. So you've got Eric Davis, who for one reason or another is separated from NIDS, or was separated from NIDS, whatever the case may be. Don't know the details on it. Quite possibly it was just because they didn't have any work for him. So Davis gets separated from NIDS. They've got no work for him. He has these hot notes directly from this incredible source, the recently retired director of the DIA director, Defense Intelligence Agency director. He's got all this, but he runs it back to the place that just showed him the door. That doesn't really make any sense to me. I mean, why would you go back to a place that just showed you the door within the last few months with this incredibly hot information? I mean, why would you do that? Again, that doesn't make any sense. It's like, why would you run back immediately with something incredible, something earth-shattering like this, and run it back to the place that just showed you the door? Again, that really doesn't make any sense. And some other things that don't exactly make any sense from the notes. This is per Wilson, per the notes, of course. Oak said Eric Davis, was a team player, would keep mouth shut, no media connections, obey all restrictions, not in government, no clearances, but pedigree excellent, and so on and so forth. Well, that didn't really take place, did it? I mean, if you buy the scenario from the pro notes folks, he'd keep his mouth shut. Well, if you believe the note, that's exactly what he didn't do. He wrote up detailed notes and ran them directly back to NIDS. So that kind of paints him as sort of a dishonest person. Not a little bit, but a lot. He's sitting there talking to the recently retired head of the DIA, says he's going to keep his mouth shut, and does the exact opposite by, again, running all this material back to NIDS. Even if you did mention that to somebody who still worked at NIDS, that you had this meeting, maybe you stay close to an individual there. I mean, that certainly happens in the real world. But do you write up these notes and bring them back to NIDS and distribute them to everybody? No, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And it seems really, A, dishonest, and B, kind of dumb. And here's another point here. Wilson specifically asked Davis, what's he going to do with this? Davis says, I'm going to keep for private personal research. No, that's exactly, if you believe the notes, that's exactly what he didn't do. And I brought this point up, that this stuff makes Davis look bad. And pro notes folks say, well, NIDS was a private company. Well, no, that doesn't work. That's not an adequate explanation for, again, what is purported within these notes. Kind of dumb, incredibly dishonest and dishonorable behavior. We'll keep mouth shut, etc., etc. That's what he says here. He made some other comments here, but he said that he will keep his mouth shut. Well, he didn't. He did the exact opposite of that. So This, well, I mean, judge for yourself. But this is another piece that doesn't make sense. Is Eric Davis this dumb and this dishonest? Especially if he might possibly. It does seem like he's out of work at this point, or looking for work, or maybe he's got something else lined up. But no job lasts forever. He might want some additional work down the road. Why would you burn the recently retired director of the Defense Intelligence Agency in this fashion? It makes no sense. Yeah, like I said, possibly he mentions a meeting to somebody, and that's it. He doesn't put anything in writing, and that's even more of a cardinal sin in terms of just discretion, putting this kind of stuff in writing. It just doesn't have the ring of truth. Now, here's a piece another piece that came up within the last week and change from Juliana Marinkovic. Now, this is actually pretty interesting, and I do note that it wasn't any of the great researchers that are out there pounding the drum for these notes. It came from Juliana, who's been compiled literally every possible reference to all this stuff in one compendium, and apparently he went back recently and he found this, and much to his credit, a lengthy interview going back not quite a decade with Dr. Mitchell. Now, of course, Dr. Mitchell talked quite a bit over the years about the initial meeting and what he was led to believe the follow-up was, the Pentagon briefing as compared to the Wilson notes. He talked a lot about that. But here he actually mentions in the last paragraph here that actually lends a little bit of credence to the notes, to an extent anyway. But let me read through it. Obviously, this doesn't prove, the way the pro-notes folks are talking, but it adds a little bit of credence, and I'll give him credit for that. Greer told Commander Miller, who called me and said, yes, Greer heard from the Admiral, and he's confirmed that there was an office in the Pentagon funding all of this. Subsequently, another contact of mine, who must also remain nameless because he's on classified programs, encountered the Admiral in Las Vegas, where he had been looking for and trying to get into the so-called strategic access program around the UFO incident and had been denied. So the two scenarios, the one that Mitchell outlines in this interview and the one in the notes, are a little bit different. Now, that always could be part of the usual discrepancies you get in retelling, just as I talked about earlier, how pro-notes folks were saying that the Mitchell papers were UFO papers were getting ready to be thrown in the trash, and Rigney said that was not the case. So here, this is different, obviously. What Mitchell is saying here is apparently Wilson is actually in Las Vegas and actually looking in, actively trying to figure out a little bit more about these strategic access programs. Doesn't give an exact date. It doesn't make any sense that if he was there in Vegas after he was retired, that he was still trying to run this stuff down. But be that as it may, this is what Mitchell said in an interview going back to 2010. It's an interesting piece. Again, it's the first bit of evidence that came out earlier in the week regarding this, and it is interesting. It doesn't prove the notes, but what it does is, again, it's an interesting piece. And of course, everybody who's pro-notes is jumping to the conclusion that the source of his, because he's on classified programs, it needs to remain nameless. And there is that. There is that piece. And then there is one final piece that I do want to get to, which is also quite interesting. And finally, I'm going to talk about the last little piece that came to us by way of Bob McGuire. Now, Bob's a solid guy. He's got a solid resume. He is currently working as the chief scientist in the office of the executive director at the Hume Center at Virginia Tech. And Bob has a long history involved with the government, that he worked for more than 26 years as a member of the technical staff at the Institute for Defense Analysis Center for Communications Research in Princeton, New Jersey. And that's how Bob became a part of our story. Now, he came out within the last week or so, and a little bit more than a week now, and said that while he was working at this DAC, that he was in contact with Admiral Wilson, knew him a little bit while he was head of the DIA, so he knew who he was. That was during the 99-02 time frame. Knows who Wilson is, and that somewhere on the order of 2004, 2005, that what he was able to do was to see a letter from Admiral Wilson to some unnamed party who showed him this letter that confirmed the meeting with Davis and the content of the meeting before it was widely distributed. Now, that is certainly an interesting piece. It came about because Dave Scott at his Facebook had asked, what are your thoughts on the Wilson notes? And this was Bob's response. And it is interesting as far as it goes. There are obviously some more details we'd like to know. I don't expect that he's going to give up who showed him the letter. And when he says the content of the letter, not sure exactly what that means, but or the content of the meeting, not sure exactly what that means. But nevertheless, it is interesting. And he has answered some additional questions from Joe Murgia and from Keith Basterfield related to this. So we will see. Again, it only took a couple years. It only took a year for a couple pieces of independent information, independent supporting evidence to come forward regarding these notes. We've got them now. It certainly doesn't prove that the notes are accurate, but again, a couple of interesting pieces of evidence, and we'll see if the pro notes folks are able to come up with a little bit more. Certainly, I think I've been able to provide a couple of problems with the notes. I'm thinking that it might be possible that Davis and Wilson did have some sort of an exchange somewhere along the line about the meeting that we know took place regarding in the Pentagon. I want to be clear about that. It gets a little complicated. In the Pentagon with Wilson, Greer et al. And that Wilson's follow-up may not be exactly what was presented, but again, what's claimed in the notes goes a lot further than any of that in terms of Wilson being told by this unnamed defense contractor that what they have in their possession is was not manufactured anywhere on Earth. I think it's maybe possible, if it did happen, that maybe Wilson confirmed the word that slipped out to Greer and Mitchell initially that yeah, he did follow up and was denied access to this program, but maybe Davis did nothing more than mention it to an old friend back at NIDS, and that got turned into this rather expansive notes tale. I'm open to that as a possibility, although it's hardly proved. Again, still remain highly skeptical of the notes. We will see. Pro notes folks are saying, well, the New York Times is on this, and in fact, Ralph Blumenthal did kick the tires on the story by contacting Michael W. Hall, but that doesn't mean that they're going to go with this story, that they're going to prove it, that they might well be working on a crash retrieval story, and that will be coming out now. It was supposed to come out 4th of July, did not come out 4th of July, but it's going to come out this week. We'll see what they've got. We'll see if the New York Times answers their prayers. It certainly would be interesting if that were the case. We'll see what they've got. Whatever they've got, it will be interesting, because it'll be fact-checked, it'll be handled properly, unlike a lot of the things that we see and hear from some of the pro notes folks. I thought one of the interesting part, and McGuire was part of that Zoom meeting last weekend, I thought it was quite interesting when you hear some of the panel members, including Richard Dolan, talk about these programs as being, these are illegal, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. This is an outrage. And then McGuire quickly jumping in and saying, well, no, this isn't illegal. This is perfectly legal. And that's one final point that I want to get to. These types of programs, sure, why wouldn't they? Why would they be illegal? Farming out certain sensitive information to well-scrutinized defense contractors. They build this stuff, so they know a lot about the high-end military equipment that they construct. They build it, so of course they know. However, that doesn't make these things illegal. But I do want to mention, of course, that there are quite a few things that could be illegal in terms of government contracts. I think that's very important, and that may well come up down the road rather than just blanketly saying, oh, these programs are illegal. But again, with lack of oversight, it certainly, and if these USAPs are not adequately looked over and looked after, abuses can go on. You have the issue of overcharging. You might have an issue of charging for work not actually getting done. And then even if all that checks out, you have the issue of spending money on these programs and what kind of dollar value are you actually getting out of them. That will be a question that I think will be coming up a little bit more as we go on. So I thought that exchange was interesting. Again, the hyperbole that comes from a lot of the pro notes folks in this field, give it a listen, but largely don't take that as any sort of an expert opinion. McGuire shut that talk down, and Melinda Leslie and her conversations with Jim Semivan shot that kind of talk down too. Again, legal, however, very important. Lack of oversight can certainly lead to abuse. There certainly can be illegalities there. And if everything is done on the up and up, still doesn't mean that we're getting value for our tax dollar. Very important things to keep in mind. So with that, I'm going to wrap the show. And you have a great week. And I will talk to you as soon as I have enough to talk to you about. Bye-bye now.